The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
On Friday, an apartment stabbing attack eventually became a series of drive-by shootings not too far from the University of California at Santa Barbara. 7 people were killed, including the attacker. 13 additional people were wounded. The attacker has since been identified as 22-year-old Elliot Rodger, and the investigations into his background and his motives have, of course, started. There have been some sober accounts, although it has been mostly these apoplectic and desperate attempts to associate him with various movements, political and otherwise, or to try to distance him from particular movements as well. Now, according to Rodger's family attorney, Rodger saw multiple therapists, was a student at Santa Barbara City College, although the school later said that he was not taking classes there any longer. The family lawyer also said that Rodger was diagnosed with high-functioning Asperger's syndrome as a child and was allegedly bullied. He had a YouTube account, a Facebook account, a blog titled Elliot Rodger's Official Blog. These have been the subject of much scrutiny over the last few days, and much being made of his frustration over not being able to find women that were attracted to him and that he could date or otherwise be around. He talked about loneliness. He talked about rejection. And in an online forum, he also stated that he was opposed to interracial dating. And in addition, he made a number of racist posts regarding African Americans, South Asians, East Asians, and saying that when he saw ethnic groups with white people, it made him want to quit life. A week prior to the shooting, his parents reported him to police after being concerned about his behavior in YouTube videos. Police did talk to him, determined that he was not really a risk in terms of real-world violence. So as usual, we have mental illness as the kind of backdrop to the story. We have a lot of other things in the background as well. We have racism. He talked about in January seeing a black guy sitting with 4 white girls. He wrote, "Today I drove through the area near my college and saw some things that were extremely rage-inducing. I passed by a restaurant and I saw this black guy chilling with 4 hot white girls. He didn't even look good. Then later that day I was shopping at Trader Joe's and saw an Indian guy with 2 above-average white girls." What rage-inducing sights did you see today? Don't you just hate seeing these things when you go out? It makes you want to quit life. This is more about, and so in the aftermath, there have been liberals and conservatives, Democrats, Republicans, trying to link this kid with a particular political ideology. Lewis, this once again is more about extremism combined with mental illness, right? The lens of right versus left is not that relevant, even though everybody seems to be having a field day with the politics associated here.
Yeah, it's kind of nonsense. Clearly, there's mental illness at play here. I feel like he wouldn't have felt so rejected if he found a girl who was a white supremacist. I think they could have gotten along great. Perhaps he was looking in the wrong place. But it's, of course, we have to bring in the gun question. Some people could say mental illness, well, we can't bring guns into it. This person was mentally ill. But then we could say, well, should mentally ill people be able to get their hands on guns so easily?
Well, let's talk about the guns, because that is an issue. Police initially investigated 9 separate crime scenes, later increasing the number to 12. And across these, they found 3 semi-automatic handguns, a Glock 34 long slide, and 2 Sig Sauer P226s, and more than 400 rounds of unspent ammunition. The LA Times reported all 3 guns found in Elliot Rodger's vehicle were purchased legally. When a firearm is purchased, there's a check on the person who purchases the firearm, right? And we're going to talk more about background checks later in the show today. But if a person has never been institutionalized, and we'll get into the detail later, they've never been institutionalized against their will, they've never been put on a psychiatric hold, according to the law, which some on the right say is too strict when it comes to background checks, they cannot be prevented from legally purchasing guns. So you're absolutely right, Lewis. There is a gun element here. We're going to talk more about that. And that seems to be kind of suffocated by the conversations about racism and autism, Asperger, etc. And the conversation about guns seems to be suppressed in this particular case.
It does. I'm sure that is motivation for some people to suppress it intentionally.
Well, let's get into some of the coverage in media about the shooting that took place at the UC Santa Barbara campus. It has been absolutely irresponsible, disgusting, and ridiculous. This is from Fox News. Fox News brought on so-called expert psychologist, really like a reality TV psychologist, Dr. Robbie Ludwig. And Dr. Robbie Ludwig suggested that what she saw here is a guy who was a frustrated gay guy in Elliot Rodger, who wasn't angry that girls wouldn't be with him, but rather angry that other men were dating these women instead of being with him. Complete irresponsible hyperbole and speculation. Here it is from Fox News.
Going on in this kid's head?
Well, it's so interesting. When I was first listening to him, I was like, oh, he's angry with women for rejecting him. And then I started to have a different idea. Is this somebody who's trying to fight against his homosexual impulses? Was he angry with women because they were taking away men from him? But this is a kid who couldn't connect and felt enraged and wanted.
Ludwig later declared on the show that Rodgers could have been angry at the men for not choosing him, instead choosing to be with women. Irresponsible, not based on fact. Just as a psychologist, this is a complete and utter irresponsibility, Lewis, but it fits in perfectly to the narrative that those on Fox want, which is, don't talk about guns, talk about how gayness might have been the cause for what went on here.
It is very irresponsible, and I really can't think of a reason why she would even bring that up, other than to just throw something outrageous out there for the audience to eat right up.
The only way that Dr. Robbie Ludwig's comments could have more directly played into the Fox News audience would have been to say that he caught homosexuality the way someone catches a cold while in Benghazi during the war on Christmas, right? I mean, that's the only way to make this more absurd and completely in line with Fox talking points.
And you forgot one thing, and that he was hired by Barack Obama to do this.
That's right. He knew Bill Ayers at some point years ago, before he was even born or something like that. Disgusting, ridiculous, an attempt to be interesting on Fox News. I don't know, but it's disgusting. Also, we can't ignore the fact that on Saturday, CNN broadcast a video statement from Richard Martinez. Richard Martinez is the father of one of the 7 victims who was killed in the Friday shooting spree at the end of the barrel of a gun held by Elliot Rodger at the University of California, Santa Barbara campus and nearby. And in that statement, he said very clearly that he thinks the NRA, as well as the entire pro-gun agenda, is in part responsible for the shooting that took place. This is the video, uncut, at least this part of it. Take a look.
Chris was a really great kid. Ask anyone who knew him. His death has left our family lost and broken. Why did Chris die? Chris died because of craven, irresponsible politicians and the NRA. They talk about gun rights. What about Chris's right to live? When will this insanity stop? When will enough people say, stop this madness? We don't have to live like this. Too many have died.
Fox News did not air that part. Now, the entire statement was only a little bit over a minute, Lewis. And you could, I guess, if we were to completely remove ourselves from the empirical reality of Fox News and the pro-gun agenda, say, well, maybe Fox just didn't have time for that part. But I think that anybody in their right mind, anybody who understands what Fox News has been doing when it comes to guns and many other issues over the last decade, would say it's not just a coincidence that they cut the 20 seconds where the victim's father says, you know, the pro-gun agenda and legislators and the NRA are at least partly responsible for this. Clearly an attempt, a direct attempt from Fox News to suppress that side of the discussion. Instead, as we talked about earlier, playing up maybe the possibility that he was just an angry gay guy, Elliot Rodger.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. We're talking about maybe an extra 20 seconds of footage here. Just like it's no coincidence when we see a D next to someone when there should be an R next to their name on Fox News. That happens all the time.
At least do the normal, more obvious Fox News thing, which is play the thing, but then have a fair and balanced panel of 5 people who disagree with the claim and none or one person who agrees with it to explain in a completely, we report, you decide way whether we should be blaming the NRA or not, right? That's the way that we would expect them to do it, but this is a new level altogether.
Right. At least they could pretend to be fair and balanced. But when you just, chop up a clip, there's really no pretending.
Part of it is, though, that they assume a lot of their audience won't find out about that speech from anywhere else. They won't even know that the NRA and pro-gun lobbies were even mentioned by the victim's father, right? They're only going to get their news from Fox News.
Sadly, right. Despite everyone like us talking about it, of course, the vast majority of the audience will never know.
Glenn Greenwald, the man who was helped Edward Snowden to tell his story, to publish his documents regarding NSA surveillance, is now saying he will name the Americans that are being monitored by the government. Glenn Greenwald says that he is going to specifically name the names of U.S. citizens targeted by the American government in what he promises is going to be by far the biggest revelation from all of the Edward Snowden related documents. He says that this is the finishing piece that is still to come. He says one of the biggest questions when it comes to domestic spying is who have been the NSA's specific targets? Are they political critics and dissidents and activists? Are they genuinely people we'd regard as terrorists? Greenwald says that the names will be published via The Intercept, which is a website funded by Pierre Omidyar, the billionaire and chairman founder of eBay. Greenwald left The Guardian, which published most of the Snowden revelations last autumn, to work for Pierre Omidyar. If we can see why these individuals are being targeted, right? In my mind, Lewis, I envision we get a list from The Intercept, and it says, Louis Motamedi, right? Targeted because he's suspected of anti-American activity at heavy metal concerts, right? If we can get a list that gives us insight into the rationale being used to put people under surveillance, that would be incredibly fascinating and compelling. However, if we get a list that is disconnected from anything else, the speculation that would result as to what may have gotten that person on the radar of authorities may lead to more confusion than clarity as to what gets you on the watch list. In either case, though, I'm very interested to see that documentation.
Either way, you're right, and I expect there will be, if there is no description, I expect there will be plenty of names that would still should not be on that list. It would just make no sense. But I expect to hear a lot of very ethnic last names on that list, David.
If we were to say we get the names with or without the list, now what happens, right? Conceptually speaking, I don't think anything really changes in terms of our understanding of the program, right? Because we already know, listen, when you're doing such broad collection of data, you're going to be collecting the data of people that absolutely mean no harm and pose no risk. And some people like Michael Hayden, former NSA chief, would say, well, you're not going to only collect the data of people who truly present a risk. By definition, there are going to be people in there that don't present a risk, and then they will go off of our radar once we determine that. However, this could have the effect of significantly activating many people if they find out they are on that list, incorrectly so. You could really activate an activist base here. And if I were Glenn Greenwald, I'd be pretty fearful for my own personal physical safety at this point.
Yes, well, I think we're past that. I think after making an announcement like this, you have to follow through with it. And you're right about the names on the list. I mean, there are people here who could discover that they're on that list and all of a sudden become fervently anti-American, if you will.
Okay, quick follow-up on a story from last week. WikiLeaks said that it would be releasing the name of the second country, in addition to the Bahamas, that has had all mobile phone records collected by the NSA. We now have found out that that country is Afghanistan. Afghanistan, the second country targeted by the NSA's massive bulk cell phone data spying program. And I have to tell you, Lewis, I don't think that this is really going to drastically change anyone's view of the NSA spying program. If you were for it, finding out that there's tracking and collection going on in Afghanistan, you're probably not going to care. If you were against it, you're probably still against it after finding out that records were being collected in Afghanistan. As interesting as it is, I don't really know. Do you think that we've gained anything new from knowing that it is Afghanistan in particular?
No, not really. But now we can speculate about what that company is that we talked about earlier that is helping the NSA in recording all of these mobile phone calls.
Right. What Lewis is referring to is that Glenn Greenwald stated the reason for not saying it is Afghanistan is because there is a small enough company involved with those record collections that you could directly put the employees and associates of that company at physical risk for their safety. In spite of that, Julian Assange saying that, you know what, knowing about this trumps any concerns about the personal safety of a small number of people. That was his view. Do you agree? And I asked that to the audience. Does the need to know this, does the benefit from knowing about Afghanistan trump the potential physical harm that could come to those involved with that company?
And I would say, should we even be asking that question, David? Because if we were never recording people in Afghanistan in the first place, none of this would be happening at all. So perhaps we can put the blame here instead of on the people releasing the information.
Let's take a break. We've got a great interview coming up today. We'll talk Trans-Pacific Partnership and so much more. It is the day after Memorial Day. We are back live. Talk to you in just a couple of minutes.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show membership program is made possible in part by liberalbias.com. Liberalbias.com is producing a new weekly video feature on their YouTube channel, Liberal Bias Video. To get the latest updates on how to uncover liberal bias in the world, subscribe to Liberal Bias Video on YouTube. Today's new member of the day is Shay Anderson. Shay Anderson is an excellent David Pakman Show member. You can check out samples now of all of the member benefits. If you go to davidpakman.com/membership, we have set up, number one, a link to the membership town halls that members can participate in. We've got another one coming up pretty soon. You can check out the bonus show hosted by producer Lewis. You can check out the commercial-free full TV show video that is available only to members and read about all of the other great member benefits. Check it out today. Why not just see what it's like? davidpakman.com/membership. We hear a lot, Lewis, from the American right about how lack of healthcare coverage doesn't lead to anybody dying. We now have the story from newsok.com of a 53-year-old man from Norman, Oklahoma, who died alone in his apartment. Heart attack and heart troubles were among the suspected causes, but according to the report, a neighbor explained that Mr. Allen was afraid to call 911 because of how much it might cost him to go to the emergency room. This is as told by Allen's neighbor, Lori, to newsok.com. Why didn't you call 911? Lori asked him. I don't have insurance, he said. She told him, you know, it doesn't matter. You can still go and get help. And he said, if I die, I die. Land of the free, home of the brave, yet this exists here and not in so many other countries that have figured out that our system of for-profit, employer-connected health insurance is just not the right system. It's not the moral system, and it's not the fiscally conservative system either, Lewis. And it's just such a sad story. He just didn't call 911 ever because he just was too afraid of the cost. He couldn't afford it. He didn't have insurance, and now he's dead.
Right. I would just remind people that there are countries on this planet where you never have to even think about money when thinking about healthcare, when thinking about operations, procedures, preventive care. Money just isn't even part of the equation ever.
Some politicians, almost exclusively American Republicans, will tell you that deaths from lack of care don't really exist. Of course, that's not true at all. Nearly 45,000 annual deaths are associated with lack of health insurance, according to a study published by the American Journal of Public Health back in 2009. The party that claims this isn't an issue, the party that wants an even more for-profit driven capitalistic system of healthcare, is the same party that calls themselves pro-life and pro-family and the party of morals. What is even remotely pro-life, pro-family, and moral about this system that they blindly defend? Absolutely nothing. Let's talk about background checks. Earlier in the show, we talked about guns in the context of the recent drive-by multiple shooting near the University of California, Santa Barbara campus. The National Rifle Association, the NRA, believes that it is bad to have more background checks, right? In spite of the fact that an overwhelming number of Americans support background checks, full background checks without exceptions for the purchase of firearms, the NRA and several groups say that these are restrictions on freedoms, they unduly burden legal and responsible gun owners, etc. We now have some data. The advocacy group, Every Town for Gun Safety, crunched some data, and citing figures from the FBI, the gun reform group explains that the number of mental health records collected from states in the National Instant Criminal Background Check System has tripled to nearly 3.5 million since 2011, and that as a result, a growing number of mentally ill people have been stopped from purchasing firearms through licensed dealers. We know, Lewis, that thousands of people in 2013, 3,000 people were blocked from purchasing guns. They tried to buy a gun and they were blocked from doing so because of this NICS system. That's 600 more than in 2012. Given the disproportionate likelihood of someone who is mentally ill to be the perpetrator of a gun crime, this is a factually good thing. My concern, Lewis, is not the argument around whether this is effective or not, but it's around the fact that the background checks are not nearly extensive enough. And as we spoke about, if you were not convicted of a felony, have a warrant for your arrest, have used drugs within the past year, were committed involuntarily to a mental institute, or are living in the U.S. illegally, the background check system won't prevent you from buying a gun. And as we know, while many perpetrators would fall under that heading, too many wouldn't. And it's clear that the background check system is not a strong enough preventative method here.
No, it's just a little speed bump in reality, but it's better than nothing, I guess.
It is better than nothing, but the place where we get bogged down is where we still have a huge group of people that argues even the background checks we have are too oppressive to so-called responsible and sane gun owners, and of course that's completely ridiculous. The House has directed the Pentagon to ignore climate change. The House passed an amendment as part of NDAA that would bar the Department of Defense from using funds to assess climate change and its implications for national security. The amendment is from Republican David McKinley. It was passed in basically a party line vote, just a few Democrats and Republicans going across party lines on this. And it says, none of the funds authorized to be appropriated or otherwise made available by this act may be used to implement the U.S. Global Change Research Program National Climate Assessment, which is an intergovernmental panel on climate change. And this, as they say, it will prohibit the costs of the president's climate change policies from being forced on the Department of Defense. Of course, this is absurd. Can you think, Lewis, of any reasons why it's important for the Department of Defense to be up to speed on climate change? I can think of many reasons through which climate change is a national security issue. Apparently, Republican David McKinley either doesn't see that or just doesn't care.
Right. And at the same time, when I think about the annual budget for Department of Defense, I'm thinking, how big of an impact would this really have?
Oh, financially, you mean? Yeah, absolutely. Right. The financial impact would be very small, but the security impact would actually be significant. When countries start feeling the effects of climate change in real, palatable, palpable ways, there is going to be a problem around shoreline. there is going to be a problem around population migration. So many issues connected to national security in reality, right? Not just the fake national security issues we hear about, are going to now be ignored because of David McKinley's narrow-mindedness to put the country's security at risk for his political ideology. It's sickening.
Yes, but I really don't expect our elected officials to make these connections, David. I just don't think it even enters their minds at all.
Yeah, it may not, sadly. Lori Wallach will join us next. TPP will be the topic of discussion. Stay with us. Join us on Facebook, facebook.com/David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
I'm joined today by Lori Wallach, who is Director of Public Citizen's Global Trade Watch, and it's really a pleasure to have her here. Lori, we've been talking about TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, for a while now, and there have been two areas of interest for me and for a lot of our audience. One is, what does TPP do, or what would it do? And then simultaneously, the secrecy with which it has been negotiated and the speed with which some legislators have wanted to kind of get it through and enact TPP. So let's take it piece by piece. What is TPP? What are the goals? What areas of life does it address?
The TPP has been branded as a trade agreement, but that's really a Trojan horse maneuver. It's got 29 chapters, and only 5 of them have anything to do with trade. Really, it's like a delivery mechanism for a set of retrograde corporate policy items, many of which have explicitly been rejected by the US Congress and by legislatures in the other countries that are involved in TPP. The way the TPP would work is the binding provision is each country shall ensure the conformity of all domestic laws, regulations, and administrative procedures with the attached chapters. And then each of these chapters would set rules on things as diverse as the safety of the food we feed our children. We'd be required to import food that doesn't meet our safety standards, whether or not we're allowed to regulate the banksters. It could roll back some of the reforms after the global financial crisis. For instance, right now, the U.S. is insisting that every signatory simply be forbidden from using capital controls, which are, and financial speculation taxes, instruments that have proved to be very useful in avoiding the terms that set a crisis. Or there are rules that would limit internet freedom, that basically sneak through the back door some of the elements of SOPA and PIPA, the legislation that Congress rejected a year and a half ago. Or there are rules relating both to patents and to what are called medicine formularies. Those are the lists of medicines that programs like the VA or Medicare, Medicaid, TRICARE get lists of medicines that they'll reimburse at certain rates that they'll pay the pharmaceutical companies. And those are cost savings for medicines. There are rules in there Big Pharma wanted both to extend patents and to allow them to challenge those pricing decisions that could jack up medicine prices. And then if that all weren't enough, these outrageous new corporate rights and privileges, in addition to the constraints on regulation. And the worst one of those is the investor state system, which would elevate any individual foreign company operating in any of the 11 other TPP countries to have the same status as the US government, to challenge domestic laws outside our courts, to privately enforce a public treaty against the US by suing the US government in extrajudicial tribunals, or 3 trade attorneys without conflict of interest rules who rotate between suing governments and being the judge get to decide how much taxpayer money a corporation should be reimbursed for the cost of having to follow basic health, safety, environmental, land use regulations.
So what was the impetus, or who got together and when and said, let's work together on this thing called TPP, right? What circumstances kind of even created this idea?
So there are 600 official U.S. corporate trade advisors. This is at the crux of our problem. These guys are setting the so-called U.S. trade policy as a corporate trade policy, and mixed in there are in with the 600 are about 30 unions, environmental consumer groups. So totally overwhelmed. And these advisors got very frustrated because they basically wanted to expand NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, that's been so devastating for U.S. jobs and devastating for Mexican agriculture, that's been a disaster of corporate attacks and environmental laws. They wanted to expand that to more countries, and they wanted to expand the rules to make them even more extreme. And they tried to do that, for instance, through the hemisphere as a thing called the Free Trade Area of the Americas. And a lot of countries said, no, thank you. Brazil, Argentina, Jamaica. So this was their next attempt at trying to expand and deepen and lock in permanently their model. So these big bunch of corporate advisors pushed it. Heartbreakingly, the Obama administration, it was something Bush started in 2008. The Obama administration picked it up. They allegedly had a review, which was not real. And they just picked up the exact Bush agenda. And the State Department has a hand in it because they're trying to sell it as an anti-China mechanism, which of course is ludicrous because, as the trade negotiators in the U.S. regularly remind us, nothing would make them happier than if China joined. TPP is supposed to be a docking agreement, which means any additional country can join later.
It's fascinating to me because as we talk about all of the ways in which the Obama administration is very different than the Bush administration, we can't ignore all of the ways in which both are just heavily ingrained in this plutocratic, money-driven system that may not even really be the result, or actually I would go further, has nothing to do specifically with George W. Bush or with President Obama, but it shows us the limited power in some areas that one person can have. And when I look at the individual chapters of this TPP, the proposed agreement, the trend I see through all of them is either via more regulation or some cases less regulation. It doesn't matter what it is. It's a decision, it's a direction that favors big business and transnational business. Are there any outliers that aren't falling under that umbrella, or is every single chapter, either by adding regulation or taking it away, supporting the interests of big business?
Well, it certainly is the big business agenda, chapter by chapter, but I wouldn't say they're adding regulation on corporations.
No, certainly not. Well, what I was thinking, to be clear, what I was thinking of, to be clear, is with intellectual property, the chapter on intellectual property adds, maybe regulation's not the right word, but it adds legal infrastructure that certainly helps the big copyright holders.
Governments.
Right.
The TPP regulates governments and limits their ability to be able to implement the basic laws we need for our human needs and goals. And it gives new rights and powers to big companies. Now, interestingly, a lot of the small business groups and conservative groups are against TPP because they're against anything that only favors the big. And so the U.S. Business and Industry Council, a very conservative small business association, is against TPP because they realize their member companies are not going to benefit from this, just the big guys are.
What is there to be done in terms of slowing down the process, which so many people seem to have an interest in expediting as much as possible? What can the average person do? What's Public Citizen doing?
So here's the good news. The TPP is a little bit like Dracula. We need to drag it out of the darkness into the sunshine. The negotiating process has been incredibly closed, secretive. Congress hasn't been allowed to see the draft text until last year, even though it's been going on for almost 5 years. So first thing is get on to a great website. It's a joint website of a lot of groups. That's called exposethetpp.org. That's www.exposethetpp.org. It's got great basic materials on every way the TPP will affect our lives, which is everything. And the materials start from something you already care about: food safety, GMOs, the environment, climate, jobs, wages, inequality, and goes the other way towards how TPP affects the thing you care about. So exposethetpp.org, get involved, get aware, help other people wake up to it. To some degree in the past, some of these most outrageous agreements literally have been Dracula strategy to death. When they're drug out into the sunshine like Dracula, they do not survive. But we cannot assume that that's going to be enough. And the mainstream media has blacked out the TPP coverage. So we have to do it word of mouth. Part two is use the power we have in Congress. So the Congress has exclusive constitutional authority over trade. It's one of the strongest checks and balances in the Constitution, and it was a fallout of the Boston Tea Party. They didn't want any king, the president, not King George, to unilaterally impose a tariff. Those tea taxes were tariffs. So the founders gave all the authority over trade to Congress. In the last 20 years, Congress has largely held on to that authority, but for 5 years. For 5 years during the Bush administration, they gave what's called fast track authority. This is an anomalous procedure that Richard Nixon cooked up. It's rarely been used in the history of the country. It never had even been thought of until 1973. And this fast track procedure basically takes away Congress's normal ability to amend, review, debate a trade agreement. It basically, from the day a negotiation starts, gives the executive branch, it gives away Congress's powers, and Congress is forced to vote yes or no in 90 days, no amendments, limited debate, including the Senate. So no matter how terrible a trade agreement is, it almost always goes through if it's on fast track. That's how we got stuck with NAFTA, the World Trade Organization. So the great news is, right now, in the House of Representatives, which is where this fast track fight is happening, President Obama, the bad news is President Obama asked for fast track. He said he wouldn't when he was a candidate, and now he's in there asking for this legislative luge run procedure. Congress so far in the House has said no. Democrats and Republicans alike. To some degree, there are things that both the right and the left don't like who likes extrajudicial tribunals attacking U.S. laws and raiding the U.S. Treasury? Who likes a ban on Buy American? Neither Democrats nor Republicans. So right now, the most single important thing, besides getting the word out in TPP, is contact your House member, the member of the House of Representatives, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican, and ask for a commitment in writing in a letter that he or she will oppose fast-track trade authority in all of its forms and retain their constitutional authority over trade. You can get a copy of that kind of a letter if you want to write it, or some talking points at our website, tradewatch.org. That's www.tradewatch.org. And what we're doing is making sure that the TPP would have to be publicly debated, exposed to the sunshine, because given what's in it, if it's normal review, it's not going to pass.
All right, we've been speaking with Lori Wallach, Director of Public Citizens Global Trade Watch. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
In her new autobiography, R&B singer Toni Braxton says that she thinks God gave her 11-year-old son autism as a punishment for an abortion she had prior to giving birth to her son. According to The Frisky, Braxton wrote in Unbreak My Heart that she found out she was pregnant when she was taking the powerful acne drug Accutane. The drug was women who were on the drug were often urged to take to be on two forms of birth control because it is really not good to get pregnant while on Accutane, as it can lead to some pretty significant fetal development problems. And she had to terminate the pregnancy with what she called major misgivings. She said, "In my heart, I felt as though I had taken a life, an action that I thought God might one day punish me for. My initial rage was quickly followed by another strong emotion, guilt. I knew I had taken a life." And she said, "I believed God's payback was to give my son autism." Braxton also gave a nod to the anti-vaccination believers by noting that she first noticed changes in her son's behavior after his first MMR vaccine. Later on, Braxton explained that her son's autism diagnosis was actually incorrect. SF Gate reported that the singer told People magazine, "I thought I was being punished for having an abortion, but I realized there is nothing wrong with my baby. He just learns differently." It's interesting how she had this revelation, not that her analysis of this vengeful and spiteful God was wrong, but rather just that her son actually didn't have autism. It's amazing, Lewis. And let's assume the hypothesis is true. Who in their right mind feels okay following a God that would punish innocent children for something the mom did that was arbitrarily, supposedly, against the religion's beliefs. How vindictive, capricious, and hateful it makes her God out to be.
Right. Well, that's, I think, one of the foundations of Christianity. You have to keep people afraid. I guess most of them believe that in some way or shape or form, their God is malevolent. And I think that's kind of what keeps you in line. And of course, to us, it's completely insane.
It's just incredible to me that she even feels the need to explain everything in the context of what God did, right? I mean, she had this abortion for a very specific and not a selfish reason, right? I mean, she didn't want, in spite of her not loving the idea of the procedure, and I've never met anyone who loves the idea of the procedure, she did it because she didn't want that potential son or daughter to have a really difficult life potentially, given the Accutane and what we know can be the birth defects. Why would that deserve such a punishment of an innocent child later born to her?
Good question. But if we're talking about religion here, I think we have to throw logic and rationale out the window.
Rafael Cruz is the father of Republican Senator Ted Cruz. He spoke at the Family Research Council's Watchmen on the Wall conference. He made the case that conservative pastors should, completely against laws that say nonprofit religious institutions should not be advocating politics, that they should actually get involved in politics. And he went further, and I have video and audio of this, and it is incredible. Rafael Cruz, who we now are realizing is way, way more extreme than we ever thought years ago as these videos come out, saying that the First Amendment was only really meant to prevent the church from being influenced by government, but that it's perfectly okay for the church to influence government. And Rafael Cruz went on to blame the end of school prayer for increases in crime and teen pregnancy. Check this out.
It is absolutely obvious that Jefferson was talking about a one-way wall to prevent government from interfering with the free exercise of religion. In no way, shape, or form can we surmise that that is preventing the church from having an influence upon every area of society as we should. The church should be influencing the media, should be influencing arts and entertainment, sports, education, business, and yes, government. Now, let's just see what has happened in the last 40 years. 1962 and 1963, prayer and Bible study were taken out of schools, and the church remained silent. Their excuse, it's a political issue. How can you infer that prayer and Bible study are a political issue? I don't know, but that's what the church did. The consequence of their silence was, after 1963, teen pregnancy skyrocketed and violent crime skyrocketed.
Yeah, the reality is that he and his right-wing friends preventing sensible sex education, limiting access to birth control, that's what's responsible for teen pregnancy. We have studies that show us that when there is better sex education, by that I mean not abstinence only, when there is better access to birth control, you reduce the number of teen pregnancies and the number of abortions, Lewis, which Cruz and his buddies claim to want to do, yet they regularly pass laws that do the exact opposite.
Right. And it's incredible when you think about Ted Cruz and how he has to distance himself from the comments of his own father. But if you think about it, I mean, it's only logical to assume that he probably believes a lot of the things his dad is saying.
By the way, in the clip, he talks about Thomas Jefferson, and he is completely wrong about Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson said in a speech to the Virginia Baptists in 1808, state churches that use government power to support themselves and force their views on persons of other faiths undermine all our civil rights. Moreover, state support of the church tends to make the clergy unresponsive to the people and leads to corruption within religion. Erecting the wall of separation between church and state, therefore, is absolutely essential in a free society. And he makes it very clear that he's not talking about a so-called one-way wall. No time for your voicemails today, unfortunately. Today on the bonus show, we will talk about problem solving at Fukushima in Japan. We will talk about a Chinese museum being closed over fake exhibits. And I'm looking forward to this. Lewis was stopped by a religious nut, as Lewis has called them, in Austin, Texas. I have not heard the story yet because I want to hear it first on the bonus show. I know you want to hear it as well. Go to davidpakman.com/membership to sign up now, be a supporter of this program, and get a great suite of membership perks. Talk to you then.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.